Hello, this is the 380T Western Classical Empires Extra Credit Test Review. And I'm just going to go down the list, answer these questions. We'll get right to it. I don't want to waste any of your precious time. And so remember that these Western Classical Empires consist of two empires, Greece and Rome. So those are the only two things that are really going to be on this test. And if you have the answers to these questions and you've studied this review, you won't be able to use it for the test, but if you study this review and know it well, you should have a very easy time with this test. So let's just go to the questions. First question is about Greece. Describe the first Greek civilization. First one we talked about was a group of people or a society of people called the Minoans, and they lived on a somewhat large Greek island to the south of mainland Greece in the Mediterranean called Crete. And some of the things that we talked about with regard to them was, for example, sports, bull jumping. They had this bull jumping sport that we don't truly understand. We don't know how they did it, but it must have been spectacular to watch. They thrived on trade. They were a trading society, traded all over the eastern Mediterranean. And just like the Indus River Valley civilization that we studied earlier, their civilization collapsed quickly and mysteriously. And we don't know much about them because although they left behind a lot of writing, we can't read it. And that's also a similarity between the Minoans and the Indus River Valley civilization. That was one of our 4 river valley civilizations. So the next question is describe the culture and politics of Athens. And the first thing you want to remember about the politics of Athens is democracy. Also, with regard to their culture, we talked about how they were advanced in sculpture and architecture. Remember that they built the Parthenon on the highest point in their city called the Acropolis. They're also known for plays, tragedies, and comedies, known for their philosophy. There was a Greek golden age that displayed advances in mathematics, physics, technology. So keep those in mind about Athens. But then it says describe the culture and politics of Sparta. And they're quite a bit different from Athens. In Athens, you want to think about democracy as a political development. But with Sparta, we're talking about oligarchy, rule by a few. And the reason that we say that Sparta was an oligarchy was because they had 2 kings at any one time. One king would be at home running things there, and then another king, the other king, would be out on the field with the troops in battle. So, rule by a few, oligarchy. We also know that the Spartans were a very warlike culture. They had no art, they had no philosophy, because they did not consider those things to be important. They're one of the most militarized societies in the history of mankind. So, where did the Greeks get their alphabet? And we know that the Greeks had a phonetic alphabet, and they got that phonetic alphabet from trade with the Phoenicians. Phoenicians, phonetic. And we studied the Phoenicians as a later civilization that was heavily influenced by the river valley civilizations like the Nile River Valley and Mesopotamia. And they had been a sea trading people. And so that's where they got their alphabet. So what do we call the writing system that they used? Well, I just said it. The Phoenicians, phonetic, telephone, Phoenicians. That's where we get the word telephone. And so it's called phonetics. The symbols represent human sounds, not concepts, but human sounds rather than concepts. And so that makes that system much more concise, much more easier to memorize because you don't have to memorize thousands and thousands of symbols. You only have to memorize, well, for example, in our case, in the case of the English language, 26 letters. So that's a lot easier than memorizing, hundreds or thousands of symbols. So, who were these Greek philosophers that we studied? There were many Greek philosophers, but we studied three in particular. The first one was Socrates. What do we know about Socrates? Socrates talked a lot about truth. All the philosophers did. He had the Socratic method. He had opposed the Peloponnesian War, and he was poisoned by the Athenian government. He was sentenced to drink hemlock. He was a strong proponent of education, and he is famous for having said, among other things, the unexamined life is not worth living. We have none of his writings. We only know about him through one of his students, the philosopher Plato. And so from there, we can just go straight to Plato. Plato was a student of Socrates, like I said. He believed that things should be run by what he called philosopher kings. He wrote a book, and that book was called The Republic, which talked about this. And he developed the what was called Platonic realism, which basically says that there are non-physical concepts that exist outside of our physical world, but also outside of our minds. So they're independent of our minds. So they exist somewhere out there, but we just can't touch them, see them, feel them, hear them with the senses. Things like, for example, numbers, mathematics, geometric forms, goodness, truth, love, thoughts, things like that. That's Platonic realism. Then the third philosopher that we talked about was Aristotle, who was actually a student of Plato and a teacher of Alexander the Great. And he gave us certain concepts or helped develop such concepts as classification and analysis and physics. He wrote a book called Politics, in which he kind of scientifically studied and compared various political systems. His views on physics and the natural world were standard and thought of as being unassailable for centuries. Unassailable means you can't attack them because they're just so true. In general, what did philosophy teach us about our world? The main thrust of philosophy is that there is a truth that is out there, and that humans can find that truth through observation and reason, the use of their minds. We're the only creatures on earth that can use our minds in that way. So the next question is to describe how democracy actually worked in Athens and who got to vote. So a democratic assembly met periodically and voted on all decisions. But it's not the kind of democracy that we would normally think of as a democracy, because it was very restrictive. Only Athenian men could be citizens and therefore participate in this democracy. No women, no slaves, no foreigners. And so this democracy that existed in Athens left a lot to be desired. It was far from perfect, but it was a start. And then we've talked about this before. What is an oligarchy? That means rule by a few, and this was what Sparta had, which I mentioned just a few minutes ago. Sparta had two kings. One took care of the city at home. One was on the battlefield. A city-state. What is a city-state? I think we might need just a reminder on what that is. And remember that a city-state is a city that is its own independent country. It has its own government. It has its own military. And so that's what a city-state is. So how was Greece, this leads us to this next question, how was Greece's political development impacted by geography? And, when you say political, that simply means who's in charge, how are leaderships structured, how are governments structured. And so remember that Greece was very mountainous, and it was very hard to get around Greece. And that makes it difficult to unify the whole area because travel and communication are both so difficult. Hence, the rise of independent city-states all over Greece. if somebody were to ask you, what was the political composition of Greece, that sounds like a really fancy thing to say, political composition. But what they really mean is, how was it governed? The answer to that question is it was made up of independent city-states. And so each of these city-states had the freedom and the latitude to experiment with different forms of government. And that's important because if you've got that many different city-states experimenting and doing government their own way and trying out different things, somebody's eventually going to come up with democracy. And that's exactly what happened. And so how was Greece's economic development impacted by its geography? Remember that Greece was rocky, mountainous, and so you can't grow a lot of food there. So as a result, in order to feed themselves, Greeks had to rely on trade. Luckily for Greece, everywhere in Greece has easy access to the sea. I mean, we've looked at maps of Greece, and it's peninsulas and islands all over the place sticking out into the Mediterranean. So, it's fairly easy to trade. It's as easy to trade in Greece as it is difficult to farm in Greece. Identify 4 specific contributions that the Greeks made to art and architecture. Keep in mind the Parthenon. That was architecture that showed balance and symmetry, and it had a huge statue of Athena, the goddess Athena, inside, which is no surprise because she was the patron goddess of Athens. That's where Athens got its name. And we also did a reading assignment in which we talked about decorative pottery. They made a lot of pottery that still survives today with all kinds of artwork on the pottery. Third, sculpture. Sculptures of ideal beauty and proportions, getting the anatomy right. We're going to see that again. Getting the humanity right. And this would be revived in the Renaissance. Also, don't forget plays and theatrical masks. The Greek word for actor is actually hypocrite. And we all know what a hypocrite is. It's a person who acts one way when they are really another way. And the word hypocrite refers to actually wearing a mask because the theatrical convention for all actors in Greek drama was to wear a mask. Otherwise, as their thinking went, how are you supposed to know that actor is playing this character and not just being himself? Got to have that mask, right? And so the word hypocrite actually comes from Greek theater, to wear a mask. What artistic values did the Greeks express in their architecture? In other words, what did Greeks like to see in their buildings? They liked to see balance. They liked to see harmony. They liked to see symmetry. And all of these design elements were intended to express the Greek love for truth and ideals. So there's a relationship there between their architecture and their values in the symmetry and in the idealness and in the harmony and in the symmetry of these various buildings that they made, especially the Parthenon. So the Persian Wars, we talked about the Persian Wars. Remember that this is in the context of Greek history, not really Persian history. But an effect of the Persian Wars was that this was the first time during the Persian Wars that these independent Greek city-states saw themselves as Greek. Up until then, people from Thebes saw themselves as Thebians. People from Athens saw themselves as Athenians. People from Sparta saw themselves as Spartans. They didn't necessarily see themselves as Greek. And what were these 4 pivotal battles of the Persian Wars? And we talked about this, when we, I kind of going back on myself. When we talked about Persia, we talked about these Persian Wars, the battles of Marathon, Thermopylae, Salamis, and Plataea. And we talked about the significance of these four battles because these battles preserved Western culture for us. Because remember, what is the title of this topic that we're doing? It's Western classical civilization, not Eastern classical civilization. And so these four Greek battles in the Persian Wars kind of preserved that for us, for better or for worse. This is not to suggest that Persian culture was so bad or so inferior. There were things about the Persian culture that made it far superior to the Greek culture in many ways. So describe a cause of the Peloponnesian War. Now, this was Greek against Greek. It was Sparta and its allies against Athens and its allies, and this war lasted a long time. And the Peloponnesian War was a competition for power and wealth and prestige, especially between Athens and Sparta, to the point where other city-states were feeling threatened by Athens and its Delian League that it had formed. It had formed an alliance called the Delian League, and Athens controlled this alliance. They called the shots, and because other city-states were feeling threatened by that, all that power, Sparta declared war on Athens and eventually won. Now, that's a cause of the Peloponnesian War, but what's an effect of the Peloponnesian War? The war weakened and impoverished all of Greece. It was so costly. And that gave Alexander the Great's father, Philip II, the opportunity to come in, sweep down from his home country of Macedonia, or Macedon, you can call it either one, to come in and take over, something that nobody had ever been able to do before. So the next question is, describe Alexander the Great. What can we say? What are some basic things that we can remember about Alexander the Great? He was a great general, never lost a battle in his entire 32 years. He destroyed the entire Persian Empire, huge empire, just demolished it. Took him a long time. It's a big empire. But he died at the age of 32, probably of a fever, although there are other theories. And he was responsible for spreading this thing called Hellenism wherever he went. So that's a perfect segue into this very, very important question, which is, what is Hellenism? So people have a tendency to kind of not be able to remember what Hellenism is. So let's go into a deeper explanation so that hopefully you can remember what Hellenism is. Hellenism is the spread all over the place, wherever the Greeks conquered, of Greek culture, Greek language, Greek ideas, Greek values, Greek architecture, Greek religion. This had a unifying effect on the entire region, from Asia to Egypt to Europe. And the fact that everybody could speak Greek facilitated trade, which brought greater prosperity to that entire region for centuries. It permitted the flow of knowledge and ideas across peoples and across distances. Alexandria, the city of Alexandria in Egypt, became a center of Greek knowledge. So many Jews spoke Greek that it became necessary to produce a Greek translation of their holy scripture from Hebrew into Greek that they could use. And we call that, the Old Testament. And that translation, called the Septuagint, produced in Egypt by Jewish and Greek scholars, became extremely popular among the Jews. Greek was the original language of the New Testament, even though it was written in Roman territory. And whenever the New Testament quotes from the Old Testament, which is very, very, very often, it quotes from the Septuagint, that Greek translation of the Old Testament. So that's Greece, and that brings us to Rome. So what language did the Romans speak? They spoke Latin, although, as we just said, Greek was widely spoken throughout the Roman Republic and Roman Empire's eastern half due to Hellenism. So describe this geography of Rome, and how did this affect Rome's culture? Rome's situation on the Italian peninsula, which sticks out way into the Mediterranean Sea, gave it access to trade ports all over that sea. Also, Rome was very close to Greece, and Greece had established large, sophisticated settlements on the Italian peninsula centuries before. And so Roman culture found a great deal of influence and inspiration from this very nearby Greek culture. Next question. Identify and describe the various classes of Roman society, and there are three to remember. The highest class was the Patricians. These were the wealthy landowners. Only patricians could participate in the Senate at first, which was Rome's ruling body, and they were a small part of the population, only about 5%. Below them were the plebeians, and these were urban working class people whose participation in the government was highly restricted. And below them, third, you had the slaves, and this was a large part of Rome's population. Rome was a slave-driven society and a slave-driven economy. So, a republic. What is a republic? Remember, Plato, Greek philosopher, wrote a book called The Republic. And so, the main difference between a republic and a monarchy is that a republic has no monarch. It doesn't want a monarch. Its rule is established by a constitution and a legislative body, such as a senate or a parliament, and or a states general or a national assembly, Congress, lots of different words for it. But they're all different words for legislative bodies. Diet. So it's more likely to have democratically elected representatives that go to that legislative body that makes the laws and makes the decisions. Now, that's not to say that a monarchy can't have a constitution. That's not to say that a monarchy can't even have a legislative body or have democratically elected leaders. But historically, these structures are much less powerful and much less independent in a monarchy. In a republic, structures like the Senate, these legislative bodies, they're much more powerful because there's no monarch in power for them to compete with. So let's describe Rome's laws. Rome prided itself on being a society of established laws and making decisions about the fate of its subjects under the rule of law, rather than under the rule of despots who could make decisions on the spot without any kind of limits or any kind of parameters. Rome's law code was called the 12 Tables, and it influenced our own legal system even to this very day. For example, the 12 Tables proclaimed that a person charged with a crime would be presumed to be innocent until he could be proven guilty by the state in a court of law. And this is a hallmark of our own judicial system, our own justice system. So we've got some people that we want to identify. So let's identify these people, just go one by one, and we'll start with Julius Caesar. What should we know about him? Well, he was a Roman politician, military leader, autocrat, which means he was a kind of an authoritarian dictator. He was a member of a three-person ruling body that we call the First Triumvirate. And we call it the First Triumvirate because there were two of them, one and then another one. So he conquered Gaul, which is modern-day France, and he took power in Rome with an army that had become loyal to him personally, not just to the state of Rome, not just the Roman Republic, but to him personally, and would do whatever he told them to do. And he eventually got Rome's ruling body, the Senate, to make him dictator for life, not just for a limited period of time, but for life. He wasn't the first person to rule the Roman Republic as a dictator. This had happened before in times of emergency. But he was by far the most prominent and most influential, and he instituted reforms to stabilize Roman society and make himself more powerful. His power increased while the power of the Senate, that ruling body that was running Rome, decreased, which is what caused him to be assassinated on the Senate floor after ruling as the Roman Republic's dictator for 3 years. So that's Julius Caesar. Now we've got his, his grandnephew Octavian. You might think that what happened to Julius Caesar would make anybody think twice about trying to assume absolute power in Rome, but you would be wrong. Octavian was Julius Caesar's great nephew. He was a member of the Roman Republic's second triumvirate. Julius Caesar, member of the first triumvirate, he was killed. There was a big bloody civil war. Things got back together, and you had this second triumvirate. And so Octavian got into a civil war against another member of the second triumvirate, Mark Antony, whose name is right below Octavian. And they got into a war for total control of the Republic, and Octavian won. And this time, he was made much more than just dictator for life. Octavian was made emperor, new title, emperor of Rome. Wait a minute, Rome's supposed to be a republic. How can it have a monarch? Well, that's a good question. He presented himself to the Roman people as a god, and his position now became hereditary, and he changed his name accordingly from Octavian to Caesar Augustus. The stories of Julius Caesar and Octavian have an important lesson to teach us today in our time of economic, social, political, and cultural crisis, if you haven't been watching the news. Times of crisis, times of fear, times of anxiety, times of uncertainty, whether it's economic uncertainty or political or social uncertainty like we're experiencing now, are times when people have to be the most vigilant about the preservation of their rights and their institutions, because guys like Julius Caesar and Mark Antony and Octavian, guys like them are still around, and they're always looking for the right time to make their move for power. They will present themselves as the only saviors and the deliverers from hardships and threats facing the nation, and they will convince people and the institutions that represent them to give them extraordinary powers so that they can supposedly implement their solutions and fix everything and save the very republic that they are really trying to destroy in order to fulfill their own personal ambitions. And before you even know what you have done, you have allowed men such as these to assume a level of control which is going to be very difficult and costly to take back from them. History, we study history because history contains lessons that will inform the decisions that we need to make today. So now let's go to Mark Antony. He was a member of that second triumvirate. He fought a civil war for control of the republic against Octavian, and like I just said, he's the one who lost. Spartacus. Good. Spartacus was a captured soldier and gladiatorial slave. He was a slave, but a special kind of slave, because he was a slave whose job was to fight other slaves for entertainment. And he led a massive slave revolt that lasted years until it was finally crushed and he himself was killed. Jesus. A Judean Jew, he was a Roman subject. He was the founder of the Christian religion, in which Jesus himself is worshiped and glorified as God and Savior. There's a lot more we could say about that. Paul, who is this Paul person? We didn't go much into Paul, but suffice it to say that Paul was a follower and a missionary of Jesus and his message, which is called the gospel, although they never actually met while Jesus was on earth. Paul was a Jewish-born Christian. He was a speaker and a writer of the Greek language. That's important. He was a major contributor to the New Testament. He contributed either 12 or 13 books to the New Testament, depending on who you want to say authored that 13th one. And he was a traveler. He was a citizen of Rome. He had the status of citizenship, and that was not an easy thing to acquire. And he was a major figure in the spread of Christianity throughout the Roman Empire, especially to non-Jewish, in other words, pagan, polytheist converts. Diocletian, we've mentioned his name numerous times. He was a Roman emperor. He was a persecutor of Christians. He claimed divinity. In other words, he claimed to be a god. He split Rome into two administrative halves because the Roman Empire was too big for one leader to run. And he was the creator of the short-lived what's called a tetrarchy. And that's where you have two leaders in each half. Tetra means four, so two in each half. One was a senior leader, one was a junior leader. Then we have Constantine. Oh, we're getting to the bottom of the page. Good. Constantine was also a Roman emperor. Significantly, he was the first Christian emperor. He got rid of that tetrarchy that Diocletian had set up. And he also got rid of that administrative split temporarily between East and West that Diocletian had set up. But he moved the capital of the entire empire to a city called Byzantium in the East and renamed that city Constantinople after himself, Constantinople. Then you've got the last person that we need to mention, Theodosius. Theodosius was also a Roman emperor. He was a Christian emperor, and he went a step further than Constantine and made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. And he left the empire to two sons in two parts. He split the Roman Empire again between East and West. He left one son in charge of the East and one son in charge of the West. So now the Roman Empire under Theodosius was completely and permanently split into two different political entities. What were Roman women allowed to do, and what were some things that Roman women could not do in Roman society? Women had more rights in Rome than they had in Greece. They could own property, and they could will that property to whomever they wanted to when they died. But they could not marry whomever they wanted, and they could not hold public office, and they could not go outside their husband's authority. So which civilization did the Romans especially admire and imitate? And we've talked about that, and that was the Greek civilization. They also owed a lot of influence to their immediate predecessors, and that was a society called the Etruscans. That's where the Romans got a lot of their military look. They got a lot of their parades and their pomp and circumstance and all that stuff. They didn't get that from the Greeks. And then what were three reasons why Christianity spread so quickly throughout the Roman Empire? Remember, Rome had a common language, Latin, but Greek was also widely spoken, especially in its eastern half. Rome was politically unified, so Christian missionaries, they didn't have to worry about crossing international borders if they were traveling within Rome. Rome also had what was called the Pax Romana. And the Pax Romana was this 2 centuries long time of relative peace throughout the entire Mediterranean, throughout their entire empire. This was before these barbarians started attacking. And this Pax Romana ensured that Christians could spread their gospel in relative safety. Rome also had highly advanced infrastructure, such as roads, aqueducts, cities. And finally, the message of this Christian gospel appealed to Rome's very large, lowly, and downtrodden section of the population, the slaves, the plebeians. Last question. What were some similarities between the fall of Rome and the fall of the Han Dynasty? Remember, the Han Dynasty was the last of 3 dynasties that existed during the Chinese classical period back over in the Eastern classical. The Roman Empire and the Han Dynasty were 2 empires that barely even knew of each other's existence. They were so far away from each other. They were at opposite ends of the thousands of miles long Silk Road. Yet, they both fell due to reasons that were remarkably similar. And we did a writing assignment on that, remember? For example, both empires were really too large to govern, given the technology and the status of communications at the time. Both empires, the Han and Rome, both went through a long period of weak emperors who lacked the talent and lacked the abilities that their predecessors had had. And both empires experienced a weakening of central government control as these weak emperors gave up control to local warlords and local generals. Both had widespread political corruption. Both had a massive wealth gap between rich people and poor people, causing discontent among the poor and causing peasant uprisings. And we drew a correlation between that and the United States because within the last few, 3-4 decades, it's particularly the wealth gap in this country, in this society, between rich people and poor people has been growing like crazy. And that's a bad sign if you're looking at history. But perhaps the most immediate threat of all that both these empires had in common was barbarian invasions. For these Germanic tribes on the other side of Rome's border that we talked about, the Roman Empire, it looked like the place to be. And that seemed to be where the prosperity was and where the security was. And the Huns coming in from Central Asia seemed to attack everywhere, north, south, east, west, Rome, as well as the Han dynasty in China. All right, so that's it. That's my answers to all of the questions. I hope that this helps. I hope you're able to write down the main points and study well and do fantastic on this test. Thank you very much.